She had two choices: freeze to death in the God-forsaken snow, or knock on the door of a man the town called a monster. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the thin fabric of her dress. Snow didn't fall. It flew sideways, a blinding white curtain that erased the world. Every gust was a slap, a reminder of how close they were to the edge. Ellen Ward pulled her shawl tighter, a pathetic shield against the biting cold. She was 25, but felt 100. Life hadn't been kind. It had been a thief, stealing her youth, her hope, her husband, though the last one she didn't miss. Gripping her skirt was a tiny, frost-nipped hand, her daughter, Anna, 6 years old, with her father's wild curls but none of his rage. Thank God for that. Anna's cheeks were the color of bruised plums, her eyes wide and trusting, fixed on the faint, flickering light ahead. It was a cabin, hunkered down against the storm like a sleeping animal, dark logs, a sagging roof, and a whisper of smoke from the chimney. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a final stop. Ellen knelt, her knees cracking in the cold. "You're sure this is the place, baby?" Anna nodded, her small face grim. "The lady in town said," she said, "he don't talk, but he needs a cook." Ellen let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh. A man who didn't talk. After a lifetime of shouting, of fists and curses, silence sounded like a prayer. It was better than nothing. It had to be. She stood up, her legs trembling. She took the 3 steps to the door, raised a hand that felt like a block of ice, and knocked. The silence that followed was heavy, long enough for every doubt to scream in her head. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe the snow was kinder. Then, the door creaked open. A man filled the frame. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and shirtless, his skin stark white against the dark night. The cold didn't seem to touch him. Long black hair fell over his shoulders, and his eyes were dark pools of ink. They didn't blink, they just watched. The air that drifted out smelled of wood smoke, of horse, of something ancient and wild. Ellen's throat was dry. I was told you need a cook." The man's gaze shifted from her face down to the small girl clinging to her leg. Anna stared right back, her little chin held high, clutching a doll made of rags and string. She wasn't afraid. Or maybe she was just too tired to be afraid anymore. The man said nothing. His face was a mask carved from stone. For a heart-stopping moment, Ellen thought he would shut the door in their faces, leaving them to the mercy of the storm. But he didn't. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped aside. It wasn't a welcome. It was a concession. Ellen didn't care. She shuffled inside, pulling Anna with her, blinking against the sudden warmth. The door shut behind them with a solid thud, sealing them in. The cabin was one room, stark and bare, a single bed against the far wall, one table, one chair, a saddle hung on the wall, and above the door, a longbow, unstrung but ready. There were no curtains, no pictures, no sign that anyone truly lived here. It was a place of waiting. Potatoes were blackening in the coals of the hearth, forgotten. Ellen looked at the silent man. He had walked past them and now sat cross-legged by the fire, his back to them. He pulled a heavy hide over his lap and began carving a piece of antler with a small, sharp knife. He moved with a practiced grace, as if they weren't even there. This wasn't rudeness. This was a wall built of silence, brick by brick, over years of something she couldn't possibly understand. "I'll make supper," Ellen whispered, her voice barely a sound. "If that's all right." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. Ellen got to work. It was what she knew. Work was survival. She found beans, a little salt, a string of onions. She rescued the potatoes, mixing them with water and whatever else she could find. She didn't look at him. She just cooked. Anna, meanwhile, had crept closer to the hearth, warming her frozen fingers. She watched the man, her head tilted. He never looked up from his carving, his hands moving with hypnotic rhythm. But when Anna shivered and leaned a little too close to the open flames, The man did something strange. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. But he shifted the heavy hide he was working on, moving it slightly so it created a small barrier between the child and the fire. A silent act of protection. Ellen saw it. And for the first time, in a long, long time, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of ice around her heart. She served the meager meal in 3 chipped bowls. She handed one to him, expecting him to ignore it. But he took it. He ate slowly, his eyes still fixed on the fire, his movements measured. She watched his hands. They were large, calloused, strong, and on his left wrist, a jagged scar snaked across the skin, white and angry, like a lightning strike frozen in time. What kind of life leaves a mark like that? After they ate, Ellen went to wash the bowls in a basin of hot water. The soap and heat stung, reopening old cuts on her palms. She winced, stifling a gasp. Suddenly, he was standing. He moved with a predator's silence she was already getting used to. He disappeared into a dark alcove and returned with a small tin and a clean piece of cloth. He held it out to her. "For your hand," he said. His voice. It was the first time she'd heard it. Deeper than she expected. Rough, like gravel, but not unkind. The sound of it startled her more than his sudden appearance. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the tin of salve. Anna was already asleep on her feet, her head lolling. Ellen lifted her daughter, the small body a familiar, precious weight in her arms. Is there a place I can put her down?" He didn't speak. He just tilted his head toward the barn. Then he reached for a lantern on a shelf, lit the wick, and handed it to her. The small flame danced between them, casting flickering shadows on his unreadable face. "Good night," Ellen murmured. He said nothing. She carried Anna out into the swirling snow, the lantern light a tiny beacon in the vast, dark wilderness. The loft above the stables was cold, but it was dry, and it smelled of hay and horses. It was a palace compared to the alleyways they had slept in. She found an old saddle blanket and laid Anna down, curling up beside her. "Mama?" Anna whispered, her voice drowsy. "Yes, baby? Is he lonely?" Ellen looked through a crack in the loft wall, at the single, unwavering light of the cabin. She thought of the scar on his wrist, of the silent way he'd protected Anna from the fire. "I think," she said softly, "he remembers what it's like to lose someone." Anna was already asleep. Ellen lay there listening to the wind, watching the snow. She didn't cry. The tears had run out weeks ago. She just stared into the quiet darkness and felt something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was the feeling of not being entirely alone. Back in the cabin, the man the town called Tattoo Red Elk sat by the fire. He looked at the antler in his hand. It was now shaped like a small bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He set it gently on the mantel. He looked toward the door. Outside, 2 sets of footprints led from his porch to the barn, a woman's and a child's. For the first time in a very long time, they didn't look like the tracks of strangers. They looked like something coming home. But home was a dangerous word in this part of the country, and Tattoo knew better than anyone that what the wilderness gives, the world of men often tries to take away. He picked up his knife. The night was far from over. The next morning broke cold and sharp. Frost coated every surface, turning the world into a landscape of brittle glass. Ellen was up before the sun, splitting kindling with a hatchet she found outside the barn. She didn't ask. She just did. Work was a prayer, and she was praying for one more day. She walked into the cabin with an armful of wood, her breath pluming in the air. Tattoo was already at the table, sharpening a long, curved knife. The scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. He watched her enter, his dark eyes missing nothing. "Coffee?" she asked, already moving to the fire. Anna tumbled in behind her, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She saw the silent man at the table and, instead of hiding, she gave him a small, sleepy smile. "Morning, mister." The rhythmic scrape of the knife paused, just for a second. Then it resumed. He didn't answer, but Ellen saw his hand still for that single beat. Breakfast was a quiet affair. 3 bowls, 3 spoons, the hiss of the fire. Tattoo hadn't touched his portion of oatmeal. Ellen slid the small pot of honey toward his bowl. He looked at it, then at her. Then he took it and drizzled a small amount over his food. A silent transaction. An understanding. Later, as Ellen scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, she felt his eyes on her. Tattoo came and went all day, a silent whirlwind of purpose. He mended a fence, checked his traps, chased a coyote away from the chickens. He never seemed to rest. He was a man in constant motion, as if stillness might let the ghosts in. She watched him through the window, hammering a new hinge on the barn door. He was shirtless again, despite the chill. The muscles in his back coiled and released with each hammer blow. He moved with a calm, focused economy. There was no wasted energy, no wasted words. Anna had taken to sitting on the porch steps watching him. She didn't chatter. She just watched, her rag doll in her lap, as if she were studying a rare and fascinating creature. Children who have seen the worst of men learn to recognize the quiet strength of a good one. That afternoon, while bathing Anna in a tin basin, Ellen saw the bruises again. Faded yellow-green marks on the girl's small ribs, ghosts of her father's fists. A wave of nausea and rage washed over her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Not here. She would not bring the ugliness of her past into this quiet, fragile space. Anna saw the look in her mother's eyes. She leaned in and whispered, her small voice fierce. "He never hit me, Mama. Not once." "I know, baby," Ellen choked out, pulling her close. "I know." The next day, something changed. Tattoo returned from his trapline not empty-handed, but with a few supplies he must have traded for. Flour, coffee beans, and a bolt of soft blue cotton cloth. He walked into the cabin, placed the bundle of cloth on the table next to where Anna sat, and then turned away as if it were nothing. Anna stared at it. Her eyes went wide. She looked at her mother, then at Tattoo's broad back. Is this for me?" He didn't answer. Ellen's voice was a soft nudge. "Say thank you, sweetheart." Anna slid off the bench. She picked up the cloth with both hands, as if it were a holy relic, and carried it over to him. She stood there, holding it up. "Thank you." Tattoo stopped what he was doing. He turned, and for the first time, he looked directly at the child. He gave a single, solemn nod. Then he went back to fixing a splintered drawer hinge. But Ellen saw it, the slightest softening around his eyes. A fortress, showing the smallest crack in its walls. The peace, however, was not meant to last. A few days later, Ellen had to go into the town of Willow Creek for lard and thread. She carried a list Tattoo had written for her on a piece of birch bark, his handwriting slanted but surprisingly elegant. The general store was a pit of whispers. She could feel the eyes on her back. Then came the voice, sharp and venomous as a snakebite. "Well, well! Didn't expect you to last a week with that red-skinned brute." It was Judith Briggs, the pastor's wife, a woman whose piety was as thin as her lips. Ellen didn't flinch. She placed her items on the counter. "He has been kind." "Kind?" Judith scoffed, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Men like that don't know kindness. They know savagery. You're a fool, Ellen Ward, and you're putting that child of yours in mortal danger. The only danger my child has ever known came from a man who went to your husband's church every Sunday," Ellen said, her voice low but clear as a bell. The store went silent. Judith's face turned a blotchy red. "People are talking, Ellen. They're saying you're his whore. What school will take your girl? What decent man will ever look at you again?" "She doesn't need a decent man," Ellen replied, grabbing her parcels. "She needs a safe home." She walked out, head held high, but her hands were shaking. The town wasn't just judgmental. It was hostile. And that hostility felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. "That night," she told him, "they're talking about us in town." Tattoo was carving again, the firelight dancing on the planes of his face. He didn't look up. "Let them talk. They think They think things. The wind talks too, he said, his knife never ceasing its whisper against the wood. It still blows past. She almost laughed. You always this philosophical? Not philosophical, careful. He paused, and for the first time, he seemed to be asking a question without words. He wanted to know what she was really afraid of. Were you married? She asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. His hands went still. The silence stretched. She thought he wouldn't answer. Yes, he finally said, his voice a low rumble. What happened? He set the carving down. It was a bear, powerful and defiant. He pushed it across the table toward her. She died. She was with child. He looked up, and his eyes were not just dark, they were haunted. White men, they came for our horses. She tried to stop them. He didn't have to say the rest. The story was there in the jagged scar on his wrist, in the fortress of silence he had built around himself. A cold dread washed over Ellen. Not just sympathy, fear. This land had a violent history, a history that wasn't finished yet. Just then, Anna wandered in from the barn, her cheeks flushed with sleep. Mama, she mumbled, I dreamed you were a bird, and you flew so high that Papa couldn't get us. Ellen's heart shattered. She pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. Tatu stood, took a blanket from his bed, and draped it over both of them. He didn't say a word. He just returned to his chair and picked up his knife. The soft, rhythmic scrape of the blade on bone was the only sound, a strange and steady comfort in the vast, dangerous quiet. A few nights later, Ellen was peeling potatoes when the knife slipped, gashing her palm. It wasn't a deep cut, but it bled freely. She hissed in pain. In a flash, Tatu was there. He took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound with warm water and wrapped it tightly with a clean strip of cloth from the same blue bolt he'd bought for Anna. His fingers were firm, efficient. When he finished, his hand lingered on her wrist for a moment longer than necessary. His thumb brushed against her pulse point. Their eyes met over the flickering lamplight, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. Something was happening between them. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something wilder, deeper, an alliance forged in silence and shared pain. A recognition. Two survivors, finding a strange sort of shelter in each other. But shelter can be seen from a distance, and in a town like Willow Creek, anything that stands out becomes a target. She could feel it in the air. The whispers were getting louder, the storm was getting closer, and she had a horrifying feeling that it wasn't just aiming for her, it was aiming for him. The town of Willow Creek had a memory as long and unforgiving as its winters, and Judith Briggs was its self-appointed historian of grudges. She saw Ellen walking across the dusty main street, Anna skipping at her side, and her face soured like curdled milk. Look at her, Judith muttered to the man standing beside her on the mercantile porch, walking around like she owns the place, like she hasn't shamed herself and this whole town by living in sin with that savage. The man, a lanky farmer named Jeb, just spat a stream of tobacco juice. Ain't our business, Judith. It is God's business, she snapped, and I am his humble servant. Ellen felt their stares like daggers in her back. She ignored them, keeping her focus on the list Tatu had given her. Thread, salt, flour, simple things. But nothing was simple anymore. Every trip to town felt like walking into a cage of hungry lions. Inside the store, the whispers started again. They weren't just about her anymore. They were about him. Heard he was part of the uprising a few years back. My cousin said he killed 3 men with his bare hands. They say he keeps scalps in a box under his bed. The lies were growing, twisting into something monstrous. Ellen's hands trembled as she paid for her goods. She grabbed Anna's hand and turned to leave, but Judith blocked her path. That man has war in his blood, Ellen, Judith said, her voice dripping with false concern. It's not a fit place for a Christian child. He is kinder to her than any Christian man has ever been, Ellen shot back. Judith leaned in closer, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. Kindness is a mask he wears. Sooner or later, the devil underneath will show his true face. And when he does, who will be there to save that little girl? The town won't lift a finger for the likes of you. It was a threat, a chillingly clear one. Ellen pushed past her and hurried out of the store, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was more than just gossip. This was a warning. Judith was trying to turn the entire town against them. She was painting a target on Tattoo's back. That night, she found Tattoo by the corral, tending to one of the horses. He was speaking to the animal in his own language, his voice a low, soothing murmur. It was a side of him she rarely saw, a gentleness he saved for the creatures who couldn't judge him. "They're telling stories about you," she said, her voice tight. "Lies." He didn't stop stroking the horse's muzzle. "Lies are just stories people want to be true. They're saying you're dangerous, a killer." He finally turned to look at her, his face unreadable in the twilight. "Am I?" The question hung in the air between them. Was he? She thought of his silent rage, the jagged scar on his wrist, the way he moved with the deadly grace of a panther. Yes, he was dangerous, but his danger had never been pointed at her or Anna. It was a shield, held up against the world. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You're not." He gave a slow nod, as if her answer was the only one that mattered. But the town's poison was seeping into their sanctuary. A few days later, Ellen went to the well to draw water and found the rope had been cut. Not frayed. Cut clean through. It was sabotage, a deliberate act of malice. She stared at the severed rope, a cold fear gripping her. This was Judith's doing. She knew it. It was a message. You are not welcome here. You are not safe. Tattoo saw the rope. He didn't speak a word. He just retrieved a new one from the barn and fixed it, his jaw set in a hard line. But that night, Ellen saw him cleaning his rifle, and the next morning, he was gone before dawn. He returned hours later, his face grim. "Tracks," he said, the single word heavy with meaning, "leading back towards town, near the Briggs's property." The confirmation sent a shiver down her spine. It was happening. Judith wasn't just talking anymore. She was acting. Then, things escalated in a way she never could have predicted. A man rode into town. A stranger. He was tall and wiry, with a cruel slash of a mouth and eyes that were too close together. He started asking questions at the saloon, at the general store. Questions about a woman with a young daughter. A widow, on the run. Ellen heard about it from the blacksmith's wife, a kind woman who sometimes slipped her an extra apple. "He's looking for you, Ellen," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Says your husband had business partners, and they think you know where he hid the money." Ellen's world tilted on its axis. Her husband, the man she'd fled from. He wasn't just an abusive drunk. He was a thief, a bank robber, and he had betrayed his partners before he died. They thought she had the stolen money. She wasn't just a widow seeking shelter. She was a fugitive. That night, she confessed everything to Tattoo. She told him about her husband, the stolen gold, the men who were hunting her. She expected him to throw her out, to tell her she had brought danger to his doorstep. He just listened, his face a stony mask. When she was finished, crying and shaking, he did something that stunned her. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You are not the woman he married," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are the woman who survived him." It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. But their moment of connection was shattered by a new, more terrifying thought. The stranger in town. What if he wasn't just asking questions? What if he was talking to people? People like Judith Briggs? Her blood ran cold. Judith hated them. She was looking for any excuse to drive them out. And Ellen had just handed her a cannon. A fugitive. A criminal's wife. Living with a savage. It was the perfect story. The perfect weapon. The trap was being set. And she and Tattoo and Anna were walking right into it. The stranger, a man whose name she learned was Silas, became a fixture in town. He was a shadow lurking at the edge of her vision every time she went for supplies. And just as she feared, he found a willing audience in Judith Briggs. One afternoon, Ellen saw them together, heads bent close on the mercantile porch. Judith was listening intently, a smug, triumphant look on her face. Silas was talking, gesturing wildly. He was telling her everything, and Judith was drinking it in like fine wine. The very next day, the sheriff came to call. Sheriff Abram Kane was a man who looked permanently tired. He rode up to the cabin, dismounted slowly, and took off his hat, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Ellen," he said, his voice heavy, "we need to talk." Tattoo appeared at the cabin door, silent as always, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a formidable presence, a guardian at the gate. "The town council is in an uproar," the sheriff said, avoiding Tattoo's gaze. "Judith Briggs has been stirring the pot. She's telling everyone you're a wanted woman, that you're mixed up with bank robbers." He paused, then finally looked at her. "Is it true?" Ellen's heart sank. This was it. "My husband was a thief," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I had no part in it. I ran from him. I ran from that life. The law doesn't always see those fine details," Kane sighed. "And Silas is claiming there's a bounty on your head. He's riling people up, saying you and Tattoo are a danger to this community. The only danger here is the ignorance you let fester in your town, Sheriff," Tattoo said, his voice low and dangerous. The sheriff flinched. "Look, I don't care about your past, Ellen, but Judith is using it. She's talking about having you removed, for the safety of the child." It was a thinly veiled threat. They were going to try to take Anna. The fear that seized Ellen was primal, fierce. It was the terror of a mother bear whose cub is threatened. "They will not take my daughter," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that surprised even her. After the sheriff left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Tattoo began to pack a small leather satchel. He was gathering dried meat, a water skin, a whetstone. "What are you doing?" Ellen asked, her stomach twisting into a knot. "We leave," he said simply. "Tonight. The mountains are safer than this place." Leave? Run again? No. She was tired of running. This cabin, this small patch of land, this silent man. This was the first place she had ever felt anything close to peace. It was the first place Anna had ever slept through the night without screaming. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "We're not running. Not this time." He stopped packing and looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "They will come for her, Ellen." "Then we will be ready for them," she said. "This is our home. I will not be driven out of my home." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his face. He slowly unpacked the satchel. They would stay, they would fight, but their enemies were more cunning than they knew. The next afternoon, Anna was playing on the porch, her beloved rag doll sitting beside her. Ellen was inside, kneading bread, her mind racing with plans, with fears. She looked out the window and saw Anna chasing a butterfly in the yard. She looked down at her dough for just a moment. When she looked back up, Anna was still there, but the doll was gone. "Mama!" Anna cried, running inside. "My dolly! She's gone!" Ellen's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a doll. It was a message, a taunt. "We can get to you. We can take what you love." Anna was inconsolable. That doll was her only link to a past before the fear, a gift from a grandmother she barely remembered. She wanted to go look for it. "Maybe the wind took it," she sobbed. "No, baby. Stay here," Ellen said, her voice tight with panic. But Anna was a child. She didn't understand the danger. While Ellen's back was turned, fetching a cup of water, Anna slipped out the door. "I'll just look by the fence," she called out. By the time Ellen realized she was gone, it was too late. She ran outside, screaming Anna's name. The yard was empty. The world was silent. Then she heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind, the sound of a child crying. It was coming from the direction of the old, abandoned church at the edge of town. Tattoo was already saddling the mare, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. He didn't need to be told. He knew. They mounted up, Ellen's arms wrapped tightly around his waist, and rode like the devil was on their heels. They found her tracks easily, small footprints in the dust, leading straight towards the church. But they weren't alone. There were other tracks, too. A woman's boots. Judith's. When they reached the clearing, the sight that greeted them was a scene from a nightmare. Judith Briggs stood before the church steps, her face alight with righteous fury. With her were two other townswomen and, to Ellen's horror, Silas. He had Anna by the arm, the little girl struggling and crying, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Unhand my daughter!" Ellen screamed, leaping from the horse before it had even stopped. "This is no longer your daughter," Judith declared, her voice ringing with fanaticism. "She is a child of God, and we are rescuing her from a life of sin and filth. We will cleanse her and find her a proper Christian home." "This is kidnapping!" Ellen shrieked, moving forward. Silas stepped in her way, a cruel smile on his face. Now, Ellen, there's a bounty, remember? The town council has decreed you unfit. I'm just collecting. The girl is collateral." He was going to sell her. He was going to sell her daughter. Suddenly, Tattoo was there. He hadn't made a sound. One moment he was by the horse, the next he was standing between Silas and Ellen, a silent, immovable mountain. He wasn't looking at Judith. He wasn't looking at Ellen. His eyes were fixed on Silas. There was a strange light in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, of a memory, dark and terrible, rising from a deep grave. Silas took a step back, his bravado faltering under Tattoo's unnerving stare. "What are you looking at, Injun?" Tattoo's voice, when it came, was as cold and sharp as ice. "The horse you stole," he said. "It was a chestnut mare, with a white star on her forehead." Silas froze. The color drained from his face. Ellen's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the words. "The horse you stole." Tattoo took a slow step forward. "My wife. She begged for her life, and for the life of our unborn child." He raised his left hand, showing the jagged white scar on his wrist. "You held her down. Your partner. He used the knife. But I remember your face. I remember your laugh." The world stopped. Silas wasn't just a man from her husband's past. He was the man from Tattoo's past. He was one of the men who had murdered Tattoo's family. The horrifying, impossible coincidence crashed down on Ellen with the force of a physical blow. The two separate broken threads of their lives, their two separate tragedies, were not separate at all. They were tangled together, tied in a knot by this one vile man. Silas panicked. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape. He shoved Anna towards Judith and pulled a pistol from his belt. "Stay back, all of you." But Tattoo didn't stop. He kept walking forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire that had waited years to be unleashed. He was not a man anymore. He was vengeance. He was a ghost from a shallow grave, come to collect a debt written in blood. "It was you," Tattoo whispered, the sound more terrifying than any shout. "It was always you." Silas's hand trembled, the pistol shaking. He was looking at a man he thought was long dead or broken. He was looking at a reckoning he never believed would come. "Judith, he's crazy!" Silas shrieked, backing away. "You promised me! You promised the town would back me up!" Judith's face had gone pale. This wasn't the righteous crusade she had imagined. This was something dark and bloody and real. The other women were already backing away, their faces masks of terror. I was just trying to save the child," she stammered. "You were trying to save your own bitter, empty soul by destroying someone else's life." Ellen roared, her fear replaced by a white-hot rage. She lunged, not at Silas, but at Judith, tackling her to the ground and snatching Anna from her grasp. She scrambled back, holding her weeping daughter tight. Silas saw his chance. With everyone distracted, he turned the gun on Tattoo. "I should have finished the job years ago," he snarled. A shot rang out. but it wasn't from Silas's gun. Silas crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder, his pistol falling into the dust. Sheriff Kane stood at the edge of the clearing, his own gun still smoking in his hand. He walked forward slowly, his face grim, his eyes full of a weary disgust. "I heard the shouting," he said, his voice flat. He looked from the whimpering Silas to the terrified Judith, then to Ellen, who was shielding her daughter. Finally, his eyes rested on Tattoo. "It seems," the sheriff said, holstering his pistol, "I've been listening to the wrong people." He knew. He had seen the truth laid bare. The raw, ugly truth of what had happened here, not just today, but years ago. He hauled Silas to his feet. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, kidnapping, and about a dozen other things I'll think of on the way to the jail." He then turned to Judith, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pathetic tears. "And you, Judith, you're an accomplice. You can explain your version of God's will to a federal judge." He began to lead them away. Then he stopped and looked back at Ellen. "The town council has officially cleared your name," he said. "They've also deeded this land and the cabin to Tattoo Red Elk. Seems they decided to pay a long overdue debt." He gave a small, sad smile. "Your past is your own, Ellen. But your future is here. No one in Willow Creek will bother you again." He tipped his hat and led the dregs of the town's hatred away, leaving Ellen, Tattoo, and Anna standing in the quiet clearing. The storm had finally broken. Ellen looked at Tattoo. His face was no longer a mask of vengeance. The fire in his eyes had softened to embers. He looked tired. He looked free. He walked over to her and knelt down in front of Anna. He didn't speak. He just held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Anna reached out and placed her small hand in his. He closed his fingers around it gently, a silent promise, a vow. They were a strange sight. A widowed fugitive, a haunted warrior, and a little girl who had seen too much. They were three broken pieces from three different worlds. But here, in the aftermath of the storm, standing on the land that was finally, truly theirs, they fit together perfectly. They were not broken anymore. They were a family, and they were home. The days that followed were wrapped in a profound quiet. The town of Willow Creek seemed to be holding its collective breath, ashamed. The whispers died. The stares ceased. When Ellen went for supplies, people didn't meet her eyes, not out of malice, but out of a shared, unspoken regret. They had been wrong, and the proof of it was in the laughter of a little girl that now carried on the wind from the cabin on the hill. Life fell into a new rhythm, one of peace and healing. Tattoo taught Anna how to track rabbits and identify birds by their calls. Ellen taught him how to bake bread that rose high and golden. They worked side by side, mending the fences of their property, and in doing so, mending the broken parts of themselves. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a language, a shared space filled with unspoken understanding. One warm afternoon, Tattoo took them to a place Ellen had never been. A secluded grove, deep in the woods, where a massive, ancient cottonwood tree grew, its roots digging deep into the bank of a rushing creek. Beneath the tree was a small, simple mound of river stones. "This was her place," Tattoo said, his voice soft. He was speaking of his first wife. Ellen felt no jealousy, only a deep, reverent sadness. She watched as Tattoo knelt and placed a freshly picked wildflower on the stones. Anna, sensing the solemnity of the moment, did the same. Then Ellen stepped forward. She placed her hand on the warm bark of the tree. "I never knew her," she said softly, her words for the spirit that lingered there. "But I thank her, for the man she loved, for the strength he carried forward." Tattoo stood and came to her side. He looked at her, his dark eyes clear and full of a light she had never seen before. He took a thin leather cord from his pocket. He took her hand, then his own, and gently wound the cord around their joined wrists, binding them together. It wasn't a wedding by the laws of men. It was something older, deeper. A ceremony of quiet things, an acknowledgement of a bond forged in fire and sorrow, and now, finally, in peace. Anna clapped her hands, her bright, innocent joy sealing the pact. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and lavender, they sat on the porch. Anna was asleep inside, tucked securely in her bed. Tattoo was carving again, but it wasn't an animal this time. He was shaping a small, intricate ring from a piece of smooth, pale bone. He worked in silence for a long time. Then he stopped, looked at the finished ring in his palm, and held it out to her. It was etched with tiny feathers and stars. "I was making this for her," he said, his gaze drifting toward Anna's window. "But it fits you." Tears welled in Ellen's eyes as she slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. She looked at this man, this quiet, powerful man, who had faced down the ghosts of his past and hers. The man who had shown her that strength wasn't about shouting and fists, but about silent protection and unwavering loyalty. "Anna calls you Papa when she thinks we can't hear," Ellen whispered. A slow smile spread across Tattoo's face, a rare and beautiful sight, like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. "You didn't have to run from your past, Ellen. You just had to find a place where you were strong enough to turn around and face it." He was right. She wasn't a fugitive anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. They both were. They sat there together, shoulder to shoulder, as the stars began to appear in the vast, dark sky. They didn't need to speak of love. They were living it. It was in the bread she baked, the wood he chopped, the safety of their daughter's sleep. It was in the quiet space between them, a space that was no longer empty, but full to bursting with a fierce, unbreakable peace. They had found each other in the heart of a storm, two strangers with nothing left to lose. And in the ruins of their old lives, they had built something new. Not with hammers and nails, but with courage, kindness, and the quiet resilience of the human heart. They had built a home. The world is full of loud noises, of anger and judgment. But sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones whispered in the quietest places. They're stories about finding light in the darkness and strength in the scars we carry. If you believe that courage is the quietest but strongest voice of all, then make sure you subscribe, because every story we tell is a testament to the hope that refuses to be silenced.